Good evening, everybody. My name is Nina Suarez. I'm the president of East Hollywood Neighborhood Council. I'm very excited to welcome everyone tonight to our panel discussion on redlining, gentrification, housing, and the history of East Hollywood. I just wanted to thank all our contributors and guests on the three-panel event series, especially Jimmy and Samantha and all the organizations that have been planning this event for the past few months. I just wanted to let everyone know currently East Hollywood Neighborhood Council is holding elections on March 16th. You can drop off your ballot starting on March 12th at the Cahuenga Library located on 4591 Santa Monica Boulevard. These elections are important since the Neighborhood Council can support programming such as the produce box giveaways and this three-part panel series. To find out more about our elections, please visit our website, www.easthhollywood.net/elections-2021. And I am going to talk a little bit about our translation. For you to access it, please, it's important for you to select the language, including English. So for you to access this event, it's offered simultaneously in English and in Spanish. And to access the service, go on the Windows or Mac OS, please click interpretation icon on the lower right of your webinar control panel and select Spanish or English from the drop-down menu. You can also have the option to mute the original audio here. On Android and Apple OS, please click the ellipse icon, which are the three dots, from your icon from your meeting controls and select Spanish or English on the drop-down menu. You can also have the option to mute the original audio here and click done. And I'm gonna say this in Spanish for our Spanish audience. Este evento cuenta con el servicio de interpretación simultáneo al idioma español. Para acceder a este servicio en Windows, Mac OS, por favor seleccione el icono Interpretation, que se encuentra en la parte inferior derecha de su panel de control. Luego seleccione Spanish del menú de opciones. Asimismo, entra la opción de silenciar el audio original aquí. En Android o Apple iOS, por favor seleccione el icono de los puntos suspensivos, que son los 3 puntos, que se encuentra en los controles de la reunión. Luego seleccione Spanish del menú de opciones. Asimismo, entra la opción de silenciar el audio original aquí. Seleccione Done. Muchas gracias. And I'm going to pass the baton over to Jeff Maloney, who is our homelessness and prevention and displacement representative and also the chair of that committee. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Nina. Welcome, everyone. As Nina mentioned, I am the Homelessness and Displacement Prevention Chair. I also, for the Homelessness and Displacement Prevention Committee, I'm also the representative, the Homelessness and Displacement Prevention representative. It's a committee that we have with East Hollywood Neighborhood Council, and we focus on things that we can do for our community, those who are perhaps at risk of eviction or those who are already experiencing homelessness. With our committee and generally with a lot of the work I do in my private life, it's focused on finding ways that we can support those who are kind of at a disservice to a lot of things that are happening in the city, often due to gentrification. There's a lot of systematic issues, as we all know, in the city. And so within our committee in the neighborhood council, we're kind of uniquely positioned to impact change on a local government level. So for those of you who may not be familiar with how these committees and neighborhood councils work, we do things like submit community impact statements. And the way community impact statements work is they basically are speaking on behalf of an entire neighborhood. And for East Hollywood, it's over 20,000 people. And so we can make a statement on behalf of a council file perhaps that is in favor of changing the way we do rent increases, which will take away a burden on people who might be at risk of displacement. So in our committees, we have deep discussions around council files that have to do with people experiencing homelessness, often about rent control, often about things like there's a recent council file that we were going to discuss that's on a rent freeze. So we're often trying to like turn every stone that we can to find ways that we can help those who are most at risk and the most uh, fragile people within our community when it comes to their housing situation. And the good thing about these committees is that anyone in the community can join. You don't have to be someone who's elected, like a neighborhood council. Anita mentioned we have elections coming up. We are elected onto the councils, but anyone who's a stakeholder in the community can join one of these committees. So within East Hollywood Neighborhood Council, we have quite a few committees. There's arts and culture, budget and finance, business, bylaws, ethics, standing rules, executive, homelessness and displacement prevention, outreach, planning and land use management, otherwise known as PLUM, public health, safety and sustainability, youth and education, and an ad hoc LGBTQIA plus allies committee. These are all different from our regular governing board meetings, open to the public, but you as a public member can also join. You have voting power whenever we vote on actions. You can bring agenda items to those, and then those items can go to the board for approval. So it's a really, really fantastic way for folks in the community to get involved, kind of dip your toes into local government and help enact change. We're all familiar with things that need to change within our community, and this is a really fantastic way for folks to get involved on a local level and kind of jump in and take action. So that's kind of my little bit on committees and neighborhood council. I am going to pass it off now to Jimmy, who is your host for the evening, editor-in-chief of Jimbo Times, and also host of JT, the LA Storyteller podcast. Take it away, Jimmy.
Hello. Can you see me? Okay, yes, you can. I think you can. All right, thank you, Jeff. And yes, shout out to the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council, which actually supported this project, this series with a serious grant for our posters, those really prolific posters that some of y'all have seen at different businesses, legacy businesses, especially along Virgil Avenue and Santa Monica Boulevard. The East Hollywood Neighborhood Council was responsible for printing those mostly. So the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council is a serious resource. It's not perfect, but it's a sort of space where those of us who show up, we make it work to one effect or another. So thank you for that presentation, or for that shout out for the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council, I should say. I'm going to share my screen now. I believe you all can see the screen. And I want to take us through a little bit of the story behind JT, the LA Storyteller, and jimbotimes.com. So here we go. In November, I published an article on the website entitled 464 Evictions Since 2000, How LSAC Displacements Are Priming East Hollywood for a Latino and Asian Removal Project. And I sort of came across information for this article through the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which lists evictions in East Hollywood, as well as neighborhoods throughout Los Angeles, which has noted that since the year 2000, LA has actually lost nearly 27,000 rent-stabilized apartments from Los Angeles, or in Los Angeles. And so I sort of went on Google Maps, I looked at sites where Ellis Act evictions took place, and I saw stuff like this, which obviously all of us can note is a set of bungalow apartments disappeared, just suddenly disappeared, suddenly retaken by landlords and other private interest groups. And of course, that's housing, right? That's also housing that was rent stabilized in East Hollywood, a neighborhood where almost 90% of us rent apartments. So we'll have the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project come on in a little bit to say more about their work. But here's just a final glimpse at what an Ellis Act eviction can do to a home, can do to our spaces, our neighborhoods, and what it is in fact doing. But before we sort of get more into those logistics, I want to take folks on a trip on the number 4 bus, the MTA number 4 bus down Santa Monica Boulevard for a little bit about Jimbo Times, because I think it's important for us to understand why some of us do the work that we do, why we're interested in these types of issues. I started jimbotimes.com in 2014, and I'm not going to go through the entire text here, but really what I sort of, what the sort of big idea for me behind Jimbo Times was, especially at the outset, was that I sort of came from a humble place, a humble neighborhood, a humble upbringing, and so on and so forth. And therefore, it was important for me to see that represented in some way out there in the media, in culture. And I thought Jimbo Times would be a great way to do that. And so I've got some old images from the site from back in those days. These are images from 2015, the neighborhood back in 2015, and spaces throughout the neighborhood back in that year. And this is a little bit of what I sort of had in mind. I want to make an interesting observation here, which is that the term alien, which is a term that has often been used to describe immigrant communities, is one I sort of think about as I go through some of these images. Because if you sort of placed a so-called alien in an abstract world, little by little, they'd start discovering themselves. And certainly that has been the process for Jimbo Times. That was sort of instrumental to my own discovery of the website. I was just like looking at culture and the culture that was important to me. And that is what became reflected on the site over the years and what is still reflected. So on that note, shout out to Lockwood Avenue Elementary School, which is where I was. Not quite as historic as Dayton Heights, but still a very special place for yours truly. It was also built in 1910, just for the record, so it is over 100 years old. And Virgil Avenue. So it was sort of my experience at places like Lockwood Avenue Elementary, where I came across friends like with names like Sudan or Susanna or Philip or William, Angel, Sergio, and so on and so forth. And so it was at places like Lockwood where meeting an array of folks, going back to something Karen said in our first panel, the language of friendship was really important. So even though some of us were Filipino or Armenian or Latinx or African-American, friendship was friendship. And so this was true throughout our time together at Lockwood Avenue Elementary. And it's something I would carry with me, that I still carry with me to this day. I'm at least 30 years old now, if you will. Respect for elders and love for elders was something that also sort of was very instrumental in the formation of Jimbo Times. And it was through meeting elders like Roger King, whom you can read about at the website. He was a former chess coach as well as a boxing coach in and around the LACC area. And he started a chess club at Cahuenga Public Library. Cahuenga Public Library is itself 104 years old. Yeah, 104 years old. So Roger passed away, I believe it was in 2016, not long after I met him, but it's respect for elders like Roger that again informs the website and the work that I do. So about 4 years after I started Jimbo Times, I decided to put an event together right at Cahuenga Public Library known as Open Mic Saturday. And the big idea was, let's invite people like Roger King, let's invite folks from the Latinx community, from the Filipino community and the Armenian community, and let's sort of let's uplift their languages, which is what makes this neighborhood, which is what makes East Hollywood and Virgil Avenue and so on. So we held this event, and it was important in terms of sort of just establishing a ground for me personally in terms of how to create space in the neighborhood, how to invite communities together in the neighborhood, how to give space, right, more than anything else. We did it again the next year. Multilingualism, bilingualism at the very least was very key. And the following year, the event in 2019 was just as successful. We had a number of folks from the community and all sorts of different ages, all sorts of different languages were once again represented. So it was a really special space. And it was in 2019 that, along with a team of folks, I sort of got to put together, Samanta and I in particular got to design the back to school party, which was a sort of set of resources, set of workshops for folks. And that was really special. Now, if the design for this sort of seems slightly familiar for folks, it's because of this. And this is a real shout out to all the LAUSD students in the house and in the room. You all will remember these lunch tickets, right? Which meant that you had access to a free lunch. And so that was the big idea behind Back to School too. Let's make sure that everyone has access. That's what this event is about. That's what all of these spaces are about. So with this in mind, after COVID-19 or the year of COVID-19, what could our team do when we were no longer allowed to meet? We could still create space, right? We could still create something. And certainly that's what making our neighborhood redlining, gentrification, and housing is. Now, just a note, we did get this shout out about Back to School too, from LACC President Dr. Mary Gallagher, who said she was able to attend and hear all the things going on at the quote grassroots unquote level of our community. LACC was included because of the GED preparation and testing we do. We also provided information from some of our students currently attending non-credit classes. Shout out to Gregory Larson for the LACC Connect. And of course, this is making our neighborhood redlining, gentrification, and housing, the culmination of years worth of work in our community, and certainly one we are happy to share with you all now. So with these things in mind, I'm happy now to introduce our first panelist and our first presenter, Samanta Helou Hernandez, who, as you all know, is a cross collaborator for this project, a multimedia journalist, and someone who's been doing critical documentation work regarding gentrification and also resilience in our community, in our neighborhoods, in East Hollywood and in Los Angeles. Samanta, the floor is yours. It's an honor.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. Thank you for that introduction and for that beautiful presentation. If you could stop your screen recording so I can share my screen real quick, that would be great. Thank you. All right. Thank you for that introduction. So tonight's event is going to focus on gentrification. And before I get started and go into This Side of Hoover and why I started it, I do want to talk a little bit about gentrification. And I know it's a big, complex topic, but I do want to talk a little bit about some definitions that we've came up with and some links to redlining, which is what we talked about last week. So currently in the United States, a lot of formerly redline neighborhoods are being gentrified right now, right? So why is that happening? And that's what I kind of want to answer for you all tonight. So we learned last week that redlining was the system of raiding neighborhoods in the 1930s, right? So it was during the Depression, people were losing homes, there was a lot of poverty. So the president at the time wanted to figure out a way to get people out of poverty, to find ways to give people home ownership, but that wasn't equal. That wasn't done equally. So what happened is that this organization called the Homeowners Loan Corporation went around to different cities all across the nation and rated neighborhoods based on their risk level or their desirability. So, but the main thing was that the desirability was often based on race, or predominantly based on race and ethnicity. So neighborhoods that had Black people and immigrants were considered risky and undesirable and were therefore given a red grade, right? So that's why we call it redlining. And neighborhoods that had a lot of predominantly white neighborhoods that had single family housing were blue or green. So they were considered desirable for lending. So this meant that neighborhoods that were blue or green, that had a lot of white people in them and that had covenants that kept the neighborhood white, were given loans and funding. So neighborhoods that were redlined, it was very difficult and near impossible for people to get loans for houses. So people couldn't really build wealth. And a lot of people were renters, and we see that to this day, right? So, you know, I think maybe you might ask yourself, all right, well, if you are an immigrant, if you're a Black person living in a red line neighborhood at the time, why don't you just leave, right? Like, why don't you just go to a blue neighborhood or a green neighborhood where you can get a loan? But the thing is that there were these things called racially restrictive covenants, which essentially were written into the deeds of houses in these predominantly white neighborhoods that said non-whites could not occupy those homes, right? So this created a lot of segregation, and it meant that people of color kind of lived in the same neighborhoods. And it created these multi-ethnic, multiracial enclaves, which is what we talked about last week, right? Where we had Karen Birch, who's a Black woman, and her Black family lived in the Dayton Heights area of East Hollywood. We had Takashi Hoshizaki, a Japanese American, and they lived together because there really wasn't many options to live anywhere else with racially restrictive covenants. So why does this matter, right? What happened is that white people that were living in redline neighborhoods, right? Because, for example, our neighborhood, when it was redlined, was only about 15% immigrant or Black. So there were a lot of white people that were also living here. But what happens is that value or property value got attached to race, right? So those things became linked. So white people living in these redline neighborhoods, all of a sudden they can't get loans either, right? Or they're worried that their property values are going to go down. So it becomes tied to their economic success. So white people can leave. White people can go to other suburbs that have racially restrictive covenants, or to blue and green neighborhoods. So a lot of white people flee, and that's called white flight. And why this is important is because it is part of a huge disinvestment that happened in the inner cities and formerly redline neighborhoods, right? So this leads to underfunded school systems, to lack of access for healthy foods, and all kinds of different forms of disinvestment starts happening in these neighborhoods. And this means property values actually do go down, right? These policies do end up causing property values to go down. And because most people in these neighborhoods are renters, because they could never actually get loans to buy houses, they are very vulnerable to displacement. So that leads us to the current situation, right? The gentrification that we're seeing today. So in the last, few decades, developers have developed the suburbs, right? The suburbs are developed, and now there's this move back to the cities. And along with this, there is also federal funding cuts for cities, especially with the Reagan administration in the 80s, right? So all of a sudden, cities that used to get federal funding for a lot of services are kind of left to fend for themselves. So cities have to start kind of running like businesses instead of cities. So what this means is that attracting wealth, attracting people with money is good for business, right? Because those taxes they can use to pay for services that otherwise they used to get that money from the government, but now they're not getting it from the government because of a lot of these cuts, right? So a lot of cities, they want to attract development. They want to attract people moving into these neighborhoods. And where are developers gonna buy up property? Where it's the cheapest, where they can get the biggest bang for their buck and return in their investment. Where are properties cheapest? In formerly redline neighborhoods where people were disinvested in. So it's actually pretty easy to predict what neighborhood is going to be gentrified. And it's typically a neighborhood that used to be redlined, that was disinvested in, so property values got really low. And it's oftentimes also next to a gentrifying or gentrified neighborhood. So that brings us to our neighborhood, right? So specifically the little pocket of Virgil Village, it's right next to Silverlake. So Silverlake is really post-gentrification at this point. And Virgil Village was redlined. It was disinvested in, property values went down. So it becomes ripe for this form of gentrification. But I do want to note that throughout, these forms of disinvestment, these exclusionary practices, people also tried to thrive, right? And they created vibrant communities. They created neighborhoods that have really strong identities, and they fought to try to make their neighborhoods better despite these policies. So this brings me to my situation and why I started This Side of Hoover. So this is the building that I used to live in. I moved there in 2014. The landlord was a Filipino man, an elder. He had owned this building for 40 years. And most of my neighbors were Latino families or working class Latino people. And we all kind of lived there. The rent was affordable. But the landlord, he'd owned the building for a long time and wanted to retire. So he decided to sell the building. And at this point, right, when you're a property owner, you're going to sell to the highest bidder. And this is not going to be another mom and pop landlord. It was a big firm, and it was a big management company that came in. And right away, we noticed the changes. So this happened around 2016. Right away, cameras were installed in the buildings. The laundry room was locked all of a sudden. And soon enough, we received a letter that we could either temporarily relocate for 6 months, or we could take a cash for keys, essentially. We could take a buyout and leave permanently. And, most of my neighbors, including myself, we ended up taking the buyout because they don't really make it desirable for you to stay, right? You have to go live somewhere else for 6 months and then you come back. And, for a lot of people, that money means a lot. It meant a lot for me so I could keep paying rent, right? But the thing is, once you take that buyout, what happens is if you decide to stay in the neighborhood, rent is a lot higher now. So that money is really not going to last for a very long time. So I was actually fortunate to find a place right across the street. And some of my neighbors actually were able to also live in my building, but a lot of people left. So when I moved across the street, I started seeing all of a sudden this shift that happened, right? So they started renovating it. These are the last renovations that just happened. And all of a sudden, these dwellings that were filled with Latino faces and Latino families were replaced by mostly white faces and just like a very different demographic. So I had heard, about gentrification, and it was kind of a buzzword at the time, but I'd never actually experienced it like this. And to see it firsthand was really traumatic, and seeing what stress it caused to all of us, and having to leave somewhere where you've lived for a long time. One of my neighbors had lived there for 40 years. She says she was brought home from the hospital and right to this apartment building, and her father actually passed away in the same apartment. She had her kids in the same apartment. So it's whole lifetimes, right, that get displaced when these things happen. So when this happened, it really struck me, and then I quickly started to see all these changes that were happening. And at the time, I was following Instagram accounts like Veteranas en Rucas and Map Points, which use Instagram to kind of archive the legacies of people in LA, specifically the party crews that happened in the 80s and 90s. And I was like, this is a really cool way to archive histories in a way that's like really participatory, in a way that's really accessible, that people can comment and contribute. So I decided to start This Side of Hoover. And the reason I called it This Side of Hoover is because Hoover Street is kind of that dividing line between Silverlake and East Hollywood. And we were seeing the gentrification from Silverlake start to bleed in, right, into East Hollywood. So I started this account back in 2017. And the purpose was to document the gentrification and displacement that I was seeing, but also the resilience of people who live here. So I started with places, like Cha Cha Cha. This is a beloved restaurant that was in the neighborhood for 30 years. And then from one day to the next, it closed, it was demolished. And then it became these condos that, some of the condos sell for almost $1 million now. But, one of them, the most important things is talking to the people that I knew, the people that I bought pupusas from, the people that I, shopped at the market with, and my neighbors. This is actually Flor and her kids. They lived in that building with me. They had lived there for a really long time. And Wilson, the eldest son that you see on your right-hand side, we actually used to call him the mayor of Virgil Village because he knew what was happening like all the time. Like if something went down, you'd always talk to him and he knew what was up. Like he had all the skills of a reporter. But it was really, like they left. They were really sad to leave the building. They luckily found a place nearby in the neighborhood. But for Wilson, it was really traumatic because growing up on Normal Avenue was like his home. He felt really safe there. He felt really supported. And I interviewed him like a year or so after they left, and he shared some of what he felt. he just says, you know, like, they used to call me the mayor because I would always be around normal and I knew everything that would happen. Like if there was a car crash and they wanted to know or how it was, I would be like, oh yeah, I've seen that. I can tell you this or I can tell you that. Everybody started calling me the mayor because I was always there. Now I moved from normal and I'm not the mayor anymore. I felt like a big person in a small body. I felt like everybody was really paying attention to me. I felt like I could actually be somebody in life. Everybody knew me. I was basically the neighborhood watch. So, you know, living on normal was really important to him. It made him have a self-esteem, you know, and people called him the mayor of Virgil Village, and that made him feel really good. And leaving was really impactful for him. It was really traumatic. So that was one of the stories that I told. And then, you know, as This Side of Hoover evolved, one of the really important things was the participation from the people that followed me, right? So the comment section really became like a place for dialogue, a place for people to share their stories, a place for people to share their emotions, their anger, their sadness, their joy. And it's kind of like we're constructing this history together. They're telling me about their memories. Like, for example, with the swap meet, this was like a classic spot in the neighborhood for 30 years, since the 80s. And it closed and it was demolished. But people, you know, when I reported on this, people really shared, you know, like, wow, man, this was my mall back in the day. This is really sad, especially because most of the neighborhood is still relatively low income. This type of place is necessary for families and small business owners. Or, you know, people talk about their anger of like what's happening in the neighborhood and feeling like they're losing something. But then they also share their memories, you know, like where they first got their tattoo, where they would buy their fits in the 90s when they were kids. You know, memories of going with their grandmother to the swap meet and spending all day shopping there. So the comment section really has become like its own community, and together we're kind of like constructing and reconstructing the history of the neighborhood, so it's not forgotten, you know, and so people can come together and feel connected. These are just some more stories, you know, that obviously we know Lena of Wa's Golden Hen. It recently closed because they retired. It was a staple, a Chinese restaurant in the community. And, you know, people also shared, you know, like going to eat there when their grandma worked at the laundromat and getting the egg rolls, or Lena knowing their orders because she was a regular and they called her mama, and people talking about, you know, like if they didn't have enough money, Lena would hook it up, you know. And that's like really beautiful. That's how you construct the story of the community. This is another artist in the community. He's a muralist, and he shared a really powerful quote when I interviewed him. I do my art as a sign of resistance against gentrification because most of my art is about culture, religion, stuff like that. It's like, hey, we're here. We've been here. We don't need you taking over. We belong here. You don't. This is our home, right? So art is a form of resistance for him, in a place where he feels like he's kind of losing his home. And you know, besides just like the trauma of gentrification and displacement, a big part of This Side of Hoover is also recording the legacies of resilience, you know, and the fact that despite all these historic policies that can displace people, that can exclude people, people are still trying to thrive. They're still creating this vibrant place. They're still creating spaces for each other, like Cali Grill, right? California Grill, that's a big meeting space for Central Americans in the neighborhood. And this is Sandra Morena Tejeda. She's the manager and everyone knows her, you know, and she's really proud of her work. She came to the neighborhood from El Salvador, and she settled in the neighborhood because it felt like home. It felt like a little piece of home. And this is just one of her quotes from I interviewed her. I like it here because it's a little more Latino, more Latin food, Latin people. It's like having a little bit of what you left behind. The problem is that more Americans are moving here. It's a problem because the restaurants serve Central American food, which is mostly consumed by Latinos. Most of my clients are from Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. We are more united here regardless of what country we are from. We're supporting each other a little more than before, possibly because everything is changing, the laws, and we need to be more united. we're trying to feel more proud of where we're from. So, you know, and then with the pandemic, they've had to adapt, right? And our neighborhood has had to adapt. So that's really why I do what I do. I want to make sure people's stories are not forgotten, that the voices are recorded, that they're heard, that the community can add and reshape the story as we go along, and that it's not just about the displacement, but also about the resilience despite these policies that we've been talking about. So yeah, thank you very much.
Samanta, thank you so much for this presentation, and it's always wonderful to see our neighborhood represented, to have our neighborhood shouted out. We saw from youth, we saw from artists, we saw from folks making food for our communities day in and day out. So thank you very much for that, as well as your story and why you're driven to do the work that you do. I think it speaks to the critical need for storytellers of color in communities like ours, essentially documenting processes like these with a serious understanding of the processes at work. And certainly that's what This Side of Hoover is, and cheers. That's the reason we're doing this today. With that said, I want to introduce our second panelist for the evening, Terra Graziani of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, who we heard from, or which we heard a little bit about early in our presentation. So Terra Graziani is here with some cross collaborators as well, who will describe the work at the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and we will have at least one follow-up question for them after their presentation. So please, Terra, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Jimmy, and thanks to Jimmy and Samanta for planning this whole series and involving us. I'm here with Chris and Kate. If y'all want to turn your cameras on or not, I'm going to share my screen and share slides while we talk a little bit about our work. And I might jump to some web pages while Chris and Kate talk, just to show you some of our projects, which are like a little more interactive and less static. So my name is Terra Graziani. I help run an organization called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and Chris and Kate are here with me tonight. So the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project comes out of really the tenant organizing space. I think Jimmy and Samanta did a really good job at like setting the stage of like what's happening on the ground and what we're facing in East Hollywood and in a lot of neighborhoods and cities. And so the mapping project arose in San Francisco in response to a wave of gentrification that we were seeing there. And we started in 2013. Really what happened is the San Francisco Tenants Union was trying to resist the Ellis Act, and they were seeing a lot of Ellis Act evictions happening in San Francisco at that time. But they needed like a better idea of the scope and everything that was happening. So they asked us to make a map of Ellis Act evictions so they could track them. And I think that's where we started. And now we basically do research to support the tenant movement in California, who are resisting things like eviction, displacement, dispossession, and gentrification. So I just wanted to situate us in that history a little bit. So in 2017, we started the chapter of the mapping project here in Los Angeles. And I am a resident of East Hollywood. I learned so much from specifically Samanta's This Side of Hoover about this neighborhood when I moved here. So I'm really grateful for that. But yeah, so now we do everything from making maps, different visualizations of public data around housing, tenancy, basically the forces at play when we think about gentrification. And we'll get a bit more into that as we talk through some of our projects. but we also, in addition to doing more data work, we have an oral history project where we interview folks about their stories. And Kate is going to talk more about this, but we really take the approach of not wanting to just document people's loss and sometimes death through eviction, but really documenting their whole story, how they came to a neighborhood, how they make their neighborhood actively. So that's like another big piece of what we do. But I will go ahead and pass it to Kate to talk about one of our oral history projects, and then Chris, and then I'll close us out.
Hi everyone, I'm Kate, as Terra mentioned. So the Tenants in Common project is one of the early LA chapter projects. And as Terra said, it's an extension of sort of the larger oral history work that Anti-Eviction Mapping Project does and has been doing for a long time. And also, as Terra said, it sort of comes out of that life histories approach, just really trying to emphasize that there's so much more to tenants than sort of the day they were evicted or the violence that is inflicted upon them through gentrification and displacement and all of these systemic processes that happen. And so the Tenants in Common project in particular incorporates in-depth interviews with tenants, as well as these portraits, beautiful portraits that were taken by Julia Galdo, a tenant and also a member of the Northeast LA Tenants Union. And at the time of the project, she was facing an Ellis Act eviction. And so that sort of became the impetus for this project. And AEMP helped to host story booth days where anyone really who wanted to participate could come through and sort of talk about their story and have it recorded. And those are then incorporated onto this map that's seen here, which is the narratives map, which sort of overlays blue dots, which represent the personal narratives, over the map of Ellis Act evictions across LA. And all of this is still hosted on the website for Tenants in Common. Featured here is Charles Willis, who is an East Hollywood resident, and his story is on there. I would encourage you guys to go and check it out. You can listen to a lot of stories. And I think Terra will drop the link in the chat for people who are interested. And then I can pass it on to Chris to talk about the Ellis Act in the map in LA.
Buenas tardes. So mapping Ellis Act evictions was AEMP's first project in Los Angeles. So the Ellis Act was passed in 1985, right after a strong rise in tenant organizing in the late 1970s. In that struggle, some of the strongest rental protections were created, such as rent stabilization, also known as rent control, and reasonable cost for eviction policies, also known as just cause. What is the Ellis Act? So the Ellis Act essentially frames this idea that mom and pop landowners now have the opportunity to get out of the rental business and essentially sell their properties and at no fault evict their tenants. This policy has strongly been used by corporate landowners, many who have owned their properties for as little as 1 year in order to flip homes into expensive luxury projects, and also a lot of condos, many of the photos that you've seen that have been flipped, essentially destroying 27,000 units, which is around the total rent-controlled housing stock in Los Angeles. 27,000 units is mass displacement due to the Ellis Act, which is truly devastating to working class families. And if we look at the Virgil Village area alone, which spans only for about a mile, there was at least 84 Ellis Act evictions there. And as you heard earlier from Jamie, in East Hollywood, we're looking at 464 Ellis Act evictions and counting. So this is extremely destruction of Los Angeles affordable housing. And when we start thinking about like, what about like affordable housing in Los Angeles, we have to reflect that the Ellis Act alone is accountable for so many units from the market. Yeah. So yeah, that's the website. I'll pass it back to Terra.
Thanks, Chris. So before we close out, I wanted to touch on a big piece of our work, which I think is important to the conversation around gentrification and identifying what forces cause gentrification. So we do a lot of work to document and unveil really who owns our neighborhood and who owns Los Angeles, who owns property, because they have a lot of control over how the community transforms. And so I have a graph here of kind of it represents the transformation of property ownership in East Hollywood specifically, from the time right before the housing crash to 2015. And I bring this up because I think we really want to make sure we're talking about the current role that real estate plays in the violence of gentrification. So a lot of times when you hear people talk about redlining, it's a conversation about the past and the racial violence that the real estate industry did in the past. And I think we need to be identifying real estate's role in this same type of violence present day. So that's like a lot of the work that we do. So one owner is named here, and you can see this massive web of what are called LLCs that the owner is associated with. And they hide behind these LLCs, which is a limited liability corporation. It's just a company that they buy property under so that nobody knows who really owns it, which means that when a tenant gets an eviction notice and there's an LLC listed as the owner, they have no idea who to push back against, who to protest outside of their house so that they don't get evicted. And so one ask from the tenant movement has been like, how can we uncover who actually owns the property in our neighborhood, which is a lot of what we do. We're building different tools to help tenants, to basically arm tenants with that information so that they can push back against eviction and displacement. And there's so much more detail on this note to talk about, but if anyone's interested, and maybe we can talk about this more in the Q&A, but if anyone's interested, just get in touch with me and we can talk more. So this is our information if you want to join, or if you want to just talk with us. If you want to check out the Tenants in Common website, the information's here. Yeah, and thank you so much for hearing about our work tonight. We're really excited to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much, Tara, Chris, and Kate. What a show. I think we got a lot of folks in the comments section who are really excited about both mapping evictions in the city of Los Angeles and in East Hollywood, and who are also very interested in supporting the Oral History Project in one capacity or another. I know both of those are very much needed, and that you all are certainly looking for supporters and volunteers and people who are willing to tell their stories. So I did throw the link to tenantsincommon.org in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will absolutely say more in just a moment. I do want to introduce our third panelist for the evening, Stefano Medina. And I've got a pretty cool bio for Stefano to read for our audience tonight. Stefano grew up in Los Angeles and is the son of Ecuadorian immigrants. He's currently a Skadden Fellow at the Eviction Defense Network in Los Angeles, working on anti-gentrification policy and litigation alongside his sister, another EDN staff attorney handling eviction cases. Before law school, Stefano worked as a community organizer in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And Stefano, the floor is yours, my friend.
I would have made my bio much shorter if I thought you were going to read it. I apologize to everybody. I guess my history with this neighborhood began, maybe a decade before I was born. My dad moved to Los Angeles from Ecuador. And, East Hollywood was a neighborhood. It was a port of call neighborhood at the time. It was where my entire family from my dad's side who moved to Los Angeles, they moved to East Hollywood. And they lived there throughout much of the 80s. Yeah, my dad was an accountant. He was a bank teller. And, one day some guy from the record industry gave him a job. And so he bought a house in the Valley. And I guess that's, maybe part of the only reason why my sister and I can both sort of still afford to live in East Hollywood right now. My sister and I both live and work in East Hollywood. We're solidarity attorneys to the East Hollywood chapter of the Los Angeles Tenants Union. We work at the Eviction Defense Network, which is, what we do. It's in the name. We defend tenants facing eviction. And so I guess, yeah, I mean, my sister and I have been thinking and talking about gentrification. It's why we do this work. We see the housing crisis and gentrification as first and foremost, you know, like a racial justice issue. It's the big explanation for why so many people in our family and in our community, people we grew up with, are still struggling. You know, while my sister and I, you know, get to be lawyers, that's not what the picture is looking like for a lot of people in our community. One of the things that I like so much about what Samantha shared earlier is when we talk about gentrification, especially if you're a lawyer, it's easy to see the problem as thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of tragedies of people being evicted. But really, this isn't an individual problem. The real victim here is a community, a sense of belonging, a sense of support that is often all that low-income communities of color have. That's what's being taken away. But, you know, it's still pretty bad on the individual level. And I think one of the things that we like to talk about at Eden, especially when a tenant is no tiene ganas de pelear, doesn't want to fight, we just tell them how exploitative their existing, look at the average landlord-tenant relationship, right? You have person A, person B. This is part of the script. And one day, 30 years ago, they bought a home. Person A bought a house, person B rented a house. And over 30 years, both person A and person B made their monthly rent or mortgage payment on time. The homeowner, his rent payment stayed basically the same. His monthly rent payment at the beginning of the 30-year period was basically the same of what he had paid later in life. He never refinanced. Whereas the renter, well, his landlord had a legal right under the California Constitution to raise the rent, at least something, every year. And so, you know, that tenant, if he has the bad luck to have a landlord who's perhaps a corporate landlord, that tenant is going to be paying a lot more in 30 years than they were paying. And that's rent control included. But the real point of the story is you fast forward 30 years. And let's say one day at the end of 30 years, you go to your tenant and you say, hey, here is every dollar that you've paid in rent in the past 30 years. I'm giving it back to you right now. Merry Christmas. Most tenants would cry. That'd be the best luck they've had all their entire lives. They would feel like millionaires. You do the same thing to a homeowner. After 30 years, you say, congratulations, you own this house and here's every dollar you got back. And that person would feel like you robbed them. Because owning land in our economy, in our system, owning land, ownership of land, that legal relationship to a piece of property creates passive income. And when one person is paying, you know, and you put person A and person B together, which is how the story ends, and I'll end there. When person B is the renter and person A is the landlord, at the end of the day, that landlord isn't just not only getting that money back in 30 years, he never paid that money in the first place. Tenants pay the mortgage every month across Los Angeles. We make enough money. The working class communities of Los Angeles, final sentence, make enough money to pay for housing in Los Angeles right now. Housing crisis, no, you know, included. And the reason they don't, the reason they can't, is because they're paying someone else's mortgage. All right. Well, I don't have a fancy PowerPoint, so that was basically the whole thing.
No, thank you, Stefano, for that, for those frank notes. And I do want to note, with respect to this data, that there is research showing that from about 1980 to 2014, at the very least, wages increased by 13% in the city of Los Angeles. From 1980 to 2014, just a 13% increase. At the same time, from 1980 to 2014, rents increased by 55%, right? So wage inequality and the inability to keep up, as you were saying, with rising rent each year has been crucial to gentrification, crucial to displacement. And the 1980s, of course, is also when we see the largest waves of immigration to neighborhoods like East Hollywood from Asia and Latin America, right? Due to political turmoil, if you will, in these respective geographies. And so certainly what we've seen in Los Angeles is something for which there's much data, but something that we are just getting to folks more recently, especially with the advent of these spaces. I do want to ask you just one follow-up question, Stefano, for you personally. What do you think is sort of crucial for you and your sister as attorneys of color in these spaces? How do you think that that's important for tenant movements or the defense of tenants who are facing eviction? What do you see you all breaking ground with, given these roles, if you will?
Well, I mean, it's the same experience that every other person from a marginalized community has whenever they break into it's the same reason it's important to have storytellers of color. I think it's really hard for, I guess, white people or affluent people to really see what we're talking about when we talk about gentrification, because they think to themselves, well, who doesn't want a better neighborhood? Who doesn't want a bike lane? Who doesn't want a Whole Foods? Who doesn't want a yada, yada, yada? And because they see things in terms of things that are worse and things that are better, nice things and bad things. Because when you're white in this world, that is how the world is organized for you. But for a lot of other people, yeah, Whole Foods is nice, but now you have destroyed an ecosystem that allows me to stay here. So I think Natalie and I doing this work, especially when we're in spaces like this and we're talking about gentrification, which is always something that white people love having opinions about, so yeah, I think we run into a sort of very simple disconnect where the conversation is not getting off at a very ground level. And it's because the conversation has been dominated so much by people who maybe have PhDs in the subject, maybe, are economists or something, people who are passionate about, solving gentrification. But I don't think we're going to really understand what we're up against until more people like you and Samantha are organizing conversations like this.
Thank you again, Stefano, and we will get back to our panelists for a roundtable, if you will, in just a moment. Before all this, we're going to go back to stories and storytelling, and we're going to bring Samantha on, as well as a very special guest, our main eventer, our headliner for the evening, to tell us a little bit more about the personal side to gentrification and the effects of this on families such as ours, on communities such as ours. So with that said, Samantha, please join us once again and introduce our main eventer, our featured guest for the evening. And unmute yourself, Samantha. There we go.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Jimmy. I am really excited to introduce our very special guest. We are going to be talking to Doña Elvia Consuelo Perez. She is the owner of Panaderia Superpan. If you grew up in the Virgil area, you know Superpan. It was a Guatemalan bakery that also sold Salvadoran bread and Mexican pan dulce, and Doña Elvia cooked Guatemalan dishes. It was a staple in the community for almost 20 years. And in 2018, Doña Elvia had to leave the neighborhood. So it was like a very traumatic experience for the neighborhood and for Doña Elvia, but her resilience kept her going, and she still continues to make bread now in South Central. And we're going to talk to Doña Elvia, who's here. Doña Elvia, I do want to note one thing. We are going to be doing this interview in Spanish. If you want a live interpretation from Spanish to English, please look below where it says interpretation and choose English as your default. That way you can get that translation while I talk to Doña Elvia. Hola, Doña Elvia, ¿cómo está?
Hola, buenas noches.
Buenas noches, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros.
Ok, sí, ahí estuve esperando. Ajá. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches. Mi primera pregunta es, ¿nos podrías contar un poquito sobre usted y cómo es que empezó Panadería Superpan?
¿Cómo empezó? Bueno, como le hablé la primera vez, de que empecé pues muy, ¿cómo le dijera? Empezamos en el año no recuerdo qué año fue, pero cuando abrí Superpan, pues no lo abrí de una vez. Lo abrí así, como le dijera, no, solo con permiso de vender, no tenía todo equipado como cuando estaba ahí en Virgil. Empecé como un despedido vendiendo poco pan y así, entonces, y de ahí pues nos fuimos vendiendo más y más, y bendito sea Dios de que logramos a poner la campana y meter más cosas, y fue como ya Superpan se extendió más, y ya metí comida, y bueno, por siempre he hecho mis tamales, chiles rellenos, y el tamal más especial, el pache, que es de Guatemala, también de Quetzaltenango. Entonces, así fue como fuimos superando, bendito sea Dios, y de ahí pues llegó el término de que nos pidieron el lugar, y fue como, pues, como se dio cuenta usted que estaba desocupando hace como 2 años. Entonces ahí fue que yo dije, aquí se acabó Superpan, dije, oh, porque pues ya se me hacía imposible, porque pues la manera en que ellos nos estaban sacando y sin nada pues y todo eso, y tardamos 22 años ahí, entonces pues no era justo. Y entonces, pero gracias a Dios primeramente, y a ustedes, a Jimmy y todos que me ayudaron a hacer un proceso, entonces ellos pues también me ayudaron, los dueños, y ya con eso pues fue que buscamos el otro local rápido, y pues gracias a Dios ya ahora donde estamos instalados pues también no puedo quejarme de que de que pues todo a principio siempre va de poquito a poquito. Pero bendigo a Dios de que hasta aquí Él no nos ha desamparado, y sí ya estamos acreditándonos más en el negocio.
Sí. Y mucha gente amaba Superpan cuando estaban en la Virgil. ¿Qué significaba Superpan para la comunidad?
Pues ante todo, pues muchos me decían, oh, esa panadería aquí va a estar bien porque pues no hay panadería cerca y vamos a comernos un panito caliente. Y sí, nos fuimos queriendo mucho. Yo bendigo a Dios por toda la comunidad de ahí de Virgil, que sí, me dieron apoyo en todo. ¿Y qué más puedo decirle? Yo bendigo a Dios, a todos mis vecinos y otros que están ahí todavía y otros que ya no están ahí. Pero sí, nos quisimos mucho, ellos a mí y yo a ellos.
Sí. Y se me hace a mí también muy importante que usted empezó a vender no solo pan guatemalteco, pero también vendías mexicano y salvadoreño. ¿Por qué empezó a vender esos tipos de pan también?
Porque también ahí en la comunidad también habían salvadoreños, mexicanos, entonces cada quien pedía su panito. Ajá, entonces fue como empezamos a meter el pan salvadoreño, el pan mexicano, que es la concha, y el pan guatemalteco.
Entonces es como que en su panadería todos tenían un pedacito de su país, ¿no?
Eso, un pedacito en todo. Ajá, es cierto.
Y doña Elvia, ya hablaste un poquito sobre eso, pero ¿me podrías contar un poquito más en detalle qué exactamente fue lo que pasó? ¿Por qué se tuvieron que ir?
Porque lamentablemente pues vendieron el pastor era el dueño de ese lugar donde estaba la iglesia, pero lamentablemente pues él creo que tuvo unos pagos atrasados y el banco le subió todo y él ya no tuvo recursos como poder seguir con la iglesia. Entonces, pues como nosotros también dependíamos de ahí, que era esa esquinita, pues entonces nos avisó de que él, pero pues no lo llevamos muy en serio que él iba a vender ese pedazo. Y entonces ya de ahí llegaron, él nos dijo que mejor iba a arreglar. Y ya de ahí llegaron unos. Entonces le preguntamos nosotros que qué significado tenía que los señores habían llegado a ver y todo eso. Entonces, ay, dijo, es que lo voy a vender, me dijo, porque ya no tuve otro recurso más, voy a vender, dijo. Entonces, bueno, pues nos había avisado, le dijimos, porque, pues, ¿qué vamos a hacer tan pronto? ¿Dónde me voy a ir y dónde voy a conseguir otro lugar? Rápido. Entonces, entonces, no, dijo, pero es que el que me va a comprar no los va a sacar, dijo, él va a seguir, dijo, aquí dándoles, dijo, y no los va a sacar. Ok, y entonces se vendió, él hizo su trato y todo, nos quedamos con el otro dueño. El otro dueño dijo, oh, mire, dijo, necesito, le dijo a mi esposo que le den una arregladita a todo esto, dijo. Quiero que lo arreglen todo, pongan piso nuevo y por fin nos la pintó bien. Entonces nosotros le dijimos de que no podíamos seguir metiéndole dinero sin no tener un lease, porque el lease a mí ya se me había vencido. Entonces, como a mí ya se me había vencido el lease, pues muchos querían sacarme. Entonces nos paramos y le dije al señor, a este Genaro creo que se llamaba el señor, o Miguel parece, Miguel. Entonces don Miguel nos la pintó bien, de que arregláramos bonito y todo eso. Y ya estando arreglados, dijo, ya nos sentamos aquí, dijo, yo traigo los papeles y firmamos el contrato nuevamente. Bueno, pues como ver un señor de respeto, pensamos de que sí tenía palabra de hombre y que sí la iba a cumplir. Pero, ¿qué fue? Ya al poco tiempo llegan otros y dice, nosotros ya vamos a comprar el lugar. ¿Y cómo es eso? Y yo va de llamarle a él. Que qué pasaba, que por qué no nos sentábamos, como él había dicho que ya habíamos puesto piso nuevo, pusimos todo nuevo, pintaron, e incluso hasta mi esposo se quitó la mitad de un dedo por estar arreglando todo eso, miren, pensando en su palabra de él, que él iba a cumplir, pero él no cumplió con su palabra y nosotros cumplimos con arreglar el lugar donde estábamos. Y después él llega con otras personas a representarlo para volverlo a vender otra vez. Pero pues, ¿qué más hacían nosotros? Fue cuando él dijo, no, dijo, es que lo voy a vender, dijo, es que no. Y que entonces, pues, este muchacho Brian, a él le decían, no, nosotros, oiga, le decía, no es justo lo que él nos hizo, tan siquiera que nos pague pues lo que invertimos aquí. Invertimos todo esto, mi esposo se quita el dedo, le digo yo, vaya que fue solo eso, le digo. Y entonces le digo, pues sí, dice él, pero yo soy el trabajador, no soy el dueño, me decía, ¿qué vamos a hacer? Y por fin, hasta cuando se llegó el tiempo y nos dijeron que nos daban, que primero nos dijeron que nos daban 2 meses, y de ahí, ya después dijeron que no, que nos daban solo como 20 días, parece, pero ya fue después, creo yo, cuando ustedes hablaron, y dijeron que nos iban a dar un dinero. Entonces fue como nos apuraron y dijeron que ya, 20 días les damos para que nos desocupen. Y lamentablemente, pues así fue. Yo salí de Virtually, porque si no, pues ahí estuviera, porque ahí está mi gente también. Sí. Ahí está mi gente, pero te vuelvo a decir, yo le agradezco a Dios porque hemos sido muy queridos por las personas, hemos sido muy queridos porque han llegado, de ahí me han llegado a visitar y pues ahí crecieron mis nietas, puedo decirle que ahí nacieron, ahí crecieron mis hijos, también ahí crecieron. Entonces, bendigo a Dios y bendigo a ese lugar. Bendigo ese lugar también porque pues ahí nos desenvolvimos, ahí nos fuimos creciendo y ahorita donde estoy pues también, bendito sea Dios porque ya voy también sobre Ahorita lo que me hace falta ya donde estoy es solamente, como le conté la vez pasada, me sale como de 15 a 20 mil la puesta de la campana. Entonces, pero esperando en Dios que en este año tal vez logremos juntar para meter unos planos y luego pues buscar a alguien quien nos haga la campana para poderla poner estable como tenía ahí en el bridge.
Sí. ¿Y por qué es que tuvieron que, cuando decidieron continuar con Superpan, por qué es que tuvieron que irse hasta Surcentro?
Porque lamentablemente no encontramos otro lugar aquí cerca. Más cómodo no lo pudimos encontrar. En primer lugar, hallamos como 2 pedacitos, pero era más caro, casi 5,000 también o 4,000 la renta. Entonces, pues ya para eso no me daba. Entonces, pues allá, pues mi esposo y mi hijo fueron a buscar lugar y pues Dios que es tan lindo y nunca lo desampara uno. Pues fueron derechito y preguntaron, vieron ese local y dijeron de que sí lo rentaban y todo. Y sí lo encontramos favorable.
Sí. Pero usted todavía... no, sí, perdón. No, nada más quería preguntarle, usted todavía sigue viviendo en East Hollywood, ¿no? Todavía vive en...
Sí, sigo viviendo.
Todavía vive por la Virgil.
Sí, yo vivo aquí en la Santa Mónica y la Western, por la, ¿cómo se llama la calle? Flemish.
Entonces,
dentro de esas 2 calles,
días.
pero sí, viajamos todos los días a las 6 de la mañana y regresamos ya a las 7 de la noche a la casa. A las 7, 7:30 y sí viajamos hasta allá del diario.
¿Y cómo va el negocio? ¿Ya ha creado una nueva clientela?
Sí, ya he creado nueva clientela, ya gracias a Dios.
Pero todavía le falta el sistema de la campana para hacer sus comidas, ¿verdad?
Ajá, eso es lo que me falta, pero espero en Dios que Él nos va a ayudar para lograrla poner nuevamente.
Sí, sí, para vender sus comidas, ¿no? Que son muy importantes.
Ajá, porque sí hago comidita, pero no mucha, ¿verdad? No como ahí, pues ya tenía todos mis clientes ahí, jardineros y trabajadores, pintores, todo, con los panitos con frijoles. Muchos, si me están viendo, se acordarán. Se acordarán de los vecinos, muchos. Entonces, con la comidita, ahí se borró la imagen. Se borró la ajá, con la comida, yo para esos tiempos de frito, el caldo de gallina, el pepián y muchas comiditas. Ajá, entonces, sí, cuando me llaman me dice, ay, ¿cuándo va a ser el caldo de gallina? Me dicen, pues ya mero, les digo, de repente.
¿Y qué es lo que extraña de la vecindad de la Virgil? ¿Qué extraña de ahí?
Ay, pues extraño mucho. Extraño a mis vecinas más cercanas que tenía, la Marqueta, la 21, porque ahí iba a comprar. Y la 99 que está enfrente. Y pues los del taller, los mecánicos. Incluso que viera que me contaron que uno de los mecánicos dice que murió con eso del COVID. Y yo me puse pues muy triste a llorar porque fue un muchacho muy querido y muy amable. Él era salvadoreño y cuando preguntamos por él y nos dijeron, oh, Rubén, me dice, Rubén ya murió, le dijeron a mi esposo, oh, no, ¿cómo? Y porque era un joven muy querido por todos casi, porque él no tomaba ni nada de eso, pero pues realmente, como le digo, pues toda mi vecindad la extraño.
Claro, claro. Y si pudiera regresar o abrir Superpan otra vez en la vecindad, ¿lo haría?
Sí, lo haríamos, pero pues tal vez con el tiempo logramos a colocarnos tal vez por ahí en algún otro un medio donde vamos viendo lo favorable de la renta, porque a veces la renta se lo come a uno. Ajá, entonces pues probablemente tal vez sí, porque pues siempre sí. Nos hacen falta Bridget. Ajá.
Claro. Y doña Elvia, ¿nos podría decir dónde está su nueva panadería para la gente por si quiere ir a comprar pan de usted?
Estamos en el Sur Centro, en la 4951 Sur Centro.
Mil gracias, doña Elvia. ¿Hay alguna otra cosa que le gustaría decir?
Solo saludarlos a todos y usted y a los demás jóvenes que andaban con usted, que los amo, que los quiero mucho, que Dios me los bendiga y los proteja siempre de tantas cosas que hay en este mundo. Y otra cosa, saludar a mis vecinos, que si me están mirando, pues los amo. Y les doy un cordial saludo a lo de la Marqueta y a todo alrededor del vecindario.
Muchísimas gracias, doña Elvia, por tomar este tiempo. Yo sé que está bien ocupada y tenía que ir a dejar pan y todo, entonces la verdad es un gran honor contar con su presencia esta noche. Muchísimas gracias, doña Elvia.
Igualmente, señorita, yo la quiero mucho, Dios me la bendiga y adelante con su trabajo.
Igualmente, doña Elvia.
Y ahí está la para cuando quiera llegar.
Claro, sí,
Okay.
Cuando esté por allá paso a comprar panecito. Gracias, doña Elvia.
Gracias. Adiós, Dios te bendiga a los jóvenes también. Los quiero mucho a todos.
Bye, doña Elvia, gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, mil gracias. And I do want to make one note about a comment that I saw on the This Side of Hoover Instagram account after Superpan's change of location to South Central. I saw something really interesting, which was that East Hollywood's loss was South Central's gain. And I think that really is actually a fascinating observation as we think about formerly redlined neighborhoods, right? And especially gentrifying neighborhoods, and which neighborhoods are bearing the brunt of gentrification a little more rapidly than others, and how these things have a conversation, a dialogue in between them. Certainly that's the case between East Hollywood and South Central now, with this space, Superpan Bakery, that provides community wherever it may be based, as our people tend to do, right? Latinx and immigrant and African-American cultures in the city of LA, in the state of California, in this country, historically have had to make space of anything, of very little that they're given. And they've done that resiliently. And certainly Doña Elvia's cuento, if you will, to this day is a complete testament to this. I'd like to now ask all of our panelists to come back on so that we can have a little bit of a roundtable discussion and so that we can answer some questions in the Q&A and other items that we're especially passionate about getting information to our neighborhoods about. And so if everyone can turn on their camera, then cheers. And if anyone wants to make some notes, some comments to our community, to the panel in general, before we move on, I want to give space to that just as well. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to comment, if you'd like to make any notes for us just before we get going with this roundtable discussion. Semi, I want to thank you for such a difficult interview to go through. That is a neighbor of ours. That is someone with a lot of love every time that we speak to them. Doña Elvia and her family are all this way. and certainly that's what drives us in this work, is the community that we've established in these tiny moments of friendship, but true friendship. I know certainly for folks who may arrive to Virgil and places like East Hollywood from elsewhere, whether it's elsewhere in Los Angeles, elsewhere in California, spaces like Superfond Bakery are crucial in terms of home, right? And how to establish a home, how to establish an adopted mother, if you will, and an adopted father sometimes, right? And so I know that Doña Elvia has been that for many generations, and for many of us in the neighborhood just as well. Chris, I'd like to invite you just to sort of take us through a little bit of this session, this seminar, this roundtable. Tell us a little bit about the pamphlets that we've designed for making our neighborhood redlining, gentrification, and housing, so that we can tell our audience how we are looking to make stories like these, but also information like what we've described, accessible for folks such as ourselves, but also for people such as Doña Elvia, also for people like our tios and tias. Especially in the Latinx culture, we've got a lot of family, right? But that's not true of the Latinx culture either. There are strong cultures for immigrants everywhere, for African Americans everywhere, strong ties that we build, again, as the result of having very little to work with. And so our bonds are very much alive through and through. Please describe a little bit of the pamphlet process for this series, why it's important, and what you'd like people to take away from it.
Yeah, thank you, Jimmy. So creating a living document that is distributed throughout the community, it was such an important way to bring not just awareness, but also to document a lot of untold history. A lot of this information is not really generally accessible or even talked about in our communities. Like we talked about like creating a process of making our neighborhoods, but also like not really, even unless you're like super into research, you don't really know like a lot of the history of your neighborhood. So it was extremely important to just break things down as simply as possible and define terms like gentrification, redlining, what each color means, you know, and bring out like the livelihood of how the Homeowners Loan Corporation described Black and Brown immigrant communities as undesirable. And essentially the process of how that created a wealth gap and identify key housing movements, destructive housing policies, and demographics. So while working on this document, like you mentioned, our core goal was community, which is why language accessibility was at the core of this. So it was just beautiful to work with Thai CDC and other members of the community to come up with translations for Thai, Tagalog, Spanish, and Armenian. So basically making sure that the language is as clear, understandable in different languages, especially as someone that doesn't have like a background in like research or academia. I think it was really great to have these pamphlets distributed in the neighborhood. And, you know, lastly, I did want to point out, you know, to identify the role of, you know, it hasn't been discussed in this yet, but the role in policing and land. You know, we listed some clear differences in the way neighboring community of Silverlake and East Hollywood are policed, and the massive, not just the massive growth of reinvestment into our communities for housing that is like very expensive, but also reinvestment into policing East Hollywood. You know, as we break this down, we start to create a map, not just a map of our land, but also like a map of all the forces working with gentrification. So we started to understand that gentrification, housing, and policing do go hand in hand. You know, there's a strong private and public network of forces creating that experience, what we experience today, and the devastating experiences that we experience today through gentrification. Yeah, so I just definitely wanted to share that. There's a lot to say about how like our communities become playgrounds for community policing projects. And yeah, so as someone that has experienced gentrification and policing, just moving around my whole life through after rent, you know, I think was great. And, you know, I wanted to shout out to our copies and Echo Park, you know, so the owner of ER Copies, you know, he went to Marshall High School, and, you know, I went to Camino Nova High School down Virgil. So like we knew each other, and it was just great to work with him. And then as he was printing these out and reading these out, it was just like, it's so much conversations. And that is essentially what these pamphlets did. When he started going into the community, they're like, people started reliving from the photos. They're like, oh my God, like the swap meet and they start seeing some information, just like, wow, this is real, this is very real, this is what I experienced. And like just seeing it broken down into this way is like, you know, it's very, very, very cool. But yeah, I spoke too long.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. And I do think that this allows us to essentially center our conversation and the various points we've noted a little further here. So basically, gentrification and displacement, these things get very personal, right? A lot of our sort of panelists have described the way that these are not issues outside of their communities. These are not sort of theoretical grounds for them. These issues involve people that they know. These issues involve experiences they've faced personally. And so gentrification is very much a sort of survival question in a real way. The question of whether our community can survive given so much displacement, given so many policies of policing, policies of non-ownership, policies of discrimination in housing when we have tried to access housing and wealth building and so on and so forth. And so I want to ask this question for the panel generally, just to sort of establish the ground here for a moment. Are new coffee shops, including boutique shops, are these things responsible for gentrification? Are sort of the new hip places for us to go get coffee at responsible for gentrification, or are they the result of a larger systemic issue? And that's open to all of us, whoever may like.
I'll butcher this. I'll be the first to butcher this because I have to run. So this is kind of my goodbye. Nobody will miss me. I mean, I think hipster coffee shops, pop-up, whatever, all those things. I mean, yeah, they are gentrifying in my opinion. I think they make the problem worse. But clearly, I think the more you think about it, the more you realize that those things and, you know, the Fedora kids or, you know, the new film festival. Can you guys hear me? Everyone froze. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly just part of a feedback loop to answer your question, Jimmy. I mean, all those things, you know, whether you want to talk about what started the process, what was the first thing, what was the cause, like that's a, you know, a very fun intellectual conversation. I guess maybe we could have someday. But I think all those things definitely contribute in their own ways to making the problem worse. You know, listening to Chris talk about redlining just a second ago, and I guess this is the last thing, and then I'll give my goodbyes. Is just, you know, a couple of years ago, you noticed one of the weirdest things that probably nobody would have ever expected, which is a couple of years ago, for the first time in the history of mankind, you could go to an airport bookstore and buy a book about redlining in California, which is crazy. You know, redlining. I mean, nobody ever forgot about it. Certainly, nobody whose community ever experienced it. But I think so much of answering your question, Jimmy, comes down to really understanding the problem that we're up against. And the past few years, people have been really interested in redlining because there's a lot of interest behind deregulating housing production in California so that developers can cash in on the huge increase in the value of land in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland. And so those people want to look at the history of redlining and say, aha, the lesson here is that all government regulations are bad and we need to reduce government regulations. Look at redlining, isn't that so bad? But the real legacy of redlining for the communities who experience it is capitalism will do whatever it has to do in order to protect white wealth. And that's exactly what happened with redlining. And that's why today the opposite is the truth. Now that our neighborhoods are valuable to Wall Street, now there's almost like a reverse redlining. There's nothing we can do to keep these interests out. People in the chat are talking about food for less ending. And it's not because of increased wage requirements for frontline workers. It's because the value of the land in that intersection has increased. The more affluent white people move to the neighborhood, and and food for less's landlord is increasing their rent. I mean, I don't have a doubt in my mind that that's what's going on there. And so the real struggle for places like that and a community that serves the people who currently live there is more about land use and the future of community plans. So the last thing I'll say is community plan updates. There's one going on in your neighborhood and I encourage you to show up and fuck it up. Thanks everybody, I gotta run.
Yeah, we'll definitely shout out that community update plan meeting next week at 8:30 a.m. Thursday. 8:30 a.m., the Hollywood Community Update Plan. We'll say more about that at the end. Stefano, that's a great observation, and you may have a few more minutes or not, but I do want to pose this question to our panel just as well. Samanta was alluding to this earlier, the concept of having to run cities more like businesses rather than communities, if you will. The question of whether city leadership is fundamentally involved in gentrification or not. So I want to ask, essentially, what role do city leaders play? What role do city council members play? What role does the LA City Planning Commission play in gentrification, and why neighborhoods are gentrifying as they are, particularly formerly redlined neighborhoods, especially formerly redline neighborhoods, as Stefano and Samanta have pointed out. So I want to place that question there for the panelists.
Thanks, Jimmy. I can speak to this for just a second. To the question about like, what role does the government or the state, not the California state, but like the state in general, play in gentrification? And I'll just speak quickly from the experience of having gone to school for city planning. I have a master's degree in city planning, and really what I realized in that space was that city planners in a lot of cases seek to facilitate real estate investment in cities. And that's a lot of what they do. It's not what they have to do. It's not what they could do a lot of other things, right? I think like the direction that I would like to see things go in is like community control of whatever changes happen in East Hollywood and any community. But yeah, I would say that like planners have historically been really not on the side of the people who live in places like East Hollywood. And I think we're seeing that change in small ways, but I think there's like a lot of opportunity to first name that and then push people to act in different ways.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of mention two things. I wanted to quickly answer your first question about the hip coffee shops. I think it's a lot about how we feel welcome in our community. So for example, the way when I started looking into the way how it was undesirable neighborhoods, the way that I start seeing the New York Times or LA Times as describing Virgil Village is like, hey, welcome to this new hip place. Check out this XYZ bagel shop, whatever you want to call it. And that makes gentrifiers feel welcome in those communities. And the conversation about what is city planners and do to increase gentrification or affect gentrification is us talking about like, how do they protect their own wealth and targeting spaces for the protection of urban redevelopment, like revitalizing this whole concept. It's all about protecting capital investment. And when it comes to protecting capital investment, they will do it by any means necessary, which is like, that proceeds with, evictions, homeless sweeps, privatization of public spaces. So now like these parks are more policed. These parks are no longer just like, you could just go in, you start seeing cameras everywhere, private security. We start looking at the story of Alex Nieto, who was shot and killed by the San Francisco Police Department as he was eating a burrito in his own neighborhood, because in his own neighborhood that now became gentrified, they started having private policing and all this stuff that eventually led to his death. So it's about how you feel welcome in your community. It's about the how they take any means to protect their own investments. So yeah.
I think those are two great points, and I want to pay respect to both for a moment. Terra said something that I thought was really resonant here, which is that it's important to be able to name an issue, right? So when we don't have language, when we don't have the tools by which to identify what is challenging our community, what is breaking down our community, it is that much more difficult for us to organize as a result, right? The other point was regarding the way that neighborhoods are sort of called new all of a sudden in serious ways that make longtime residents feel unwelcome and that actually have serious consequences, as you were noting just earlier, Chris. So I want to get to this question for a moment, which I think is a big sort of elephant in the room I tend to think about when it comes to a discussion such as this one. Is gentrification just a process of sort of white people moving into formerly predominantly non-white neighborhoods? Is that sort of what it boils down to? And is gentrification sort of just a race issue ultimately just as well? Is this a way for us to sort of engage with racial tensions that have long histories in cities like LA and cities all over the US? Or is there more to the story here? And is it not just a white or non-white issue, if you will?
I can speak to that a little bit, or Chris, you go ahead for sure if you want. Okay, I was just gonna say that I feel like so much of what we've talked about is how just like white wealth is what's protected and how that's written into all of these laws and this whole history of housing that we've been discussing tonight. And so it is an issue of white people primarily coming into your neighborhoods, but it is also like because that's just written into the larger system. So the individual choice aspect, you can't really like solve the issue with individual choice. So it can't just be reduced to that, in my opinion. That's a huge piece of it, but also sort of just like you were talking about being able to name things, like we know that that's why it's happening and we can name that in the larger systems as well. And then that's maybe our opportunity to sort of break it down and push against the fact that white wealth accumulation through property and through land values is sort of how white people are protected, in one of the ways white people are protected in our society. And so being able to name that allows us to put pressure on the larger systems.
Yeah, I think, you know, like when we talk about gentrification, when you're on the ground, what you see are the coffee shops, the boutiques, feeling like you're not welcome anymore, feeling like you don't belong, seeing, you know, more white people walking their dogs. Like that's definitely part of it, but that's almost kind of like the symptom of like a way larger issue, right? Like we talked about, like you can go back and back and back to like why this is happening now. Like when we were talking about redlining and deed restrictions and the way these neighborhoods were just like disinvested in, and it became cheap for developers to come in. And then you'd see like neighborhoods that weren't redlined, that had like those racial covenants. They also have zoning laws that don't allow apartment buildings to be built. So then the neighborhoods that were redlined get the brunt of that, you know? So it is the coffee shop, it is the new demographics, that's like what we see, but there's like this larger system at play that started before those places showed up, right? Like developers started seeing these neighborhoods before that happened, and maybe even started, and a lot of times started buying up property and just holding on to it, hoping that it would gentrify, you know, that happens often. And then cities also can give incentives because they want to increase their tax base. So it's like it's a much larger system than just like you were saying, the individual choice. Yeah.
I wanted to, in the topic of race and gentrification, I wanted to talk about how much wealth in the United States is tied to race and is tied to whiteness. So for example, when we think of wealth, we think of this image that comes from whiteness. So as we look at our communities and you see like just like community members just having a party, enjoying, being very enjoying to like their culture, how a lot of that times through gentrification that starts being seen as a nuisance, you know? So just being happy is a nuisance because it is not the idea or the image of wealth. It is not the idea of what they think wealth is, of what they think thriving is. I think a lot of like concept of race is because race is directly related to whiteness. Wealth is directly related to whiteness in our community. So yeah, a little bit of that, you know, like there's this policy program that very much specifically targets nuisances that they label in the community for eviction. But yeah, that's my note.
I think those are great notes. And I would say just in my own sort of process, in my own development of understanding over this issue, I've had all sorts of growing opportunities, if you will. I think when someone is coming into, say, the movement for communities, for neighborhood making, neighborhood building, or the defense of neighborhoods, I think at the outset, things may look binary, as in the black and white binary, or the white and non-white binary, where it's white people versus everyone else, or it's the community versus white people to some extent. And at the same time, what I've come to learn is, when someone is coming to a city like Los Angeles because Los Angeles is being sold, Los Angeles is being promoted, which is a sort of real, like, historic way that LA has been built over many, many decades. Ever since the beginning of LA, there was this big idea of selling the city, especially to outsiders or people from the Midwest or people from the East Coast or China nowadays, if you will, or Japan in the 90s and so on and so forth. What I want to note is there are people who arrive to these cities who also don't have a sense of the history of the neighborhood they may be entering into, right? So language becomes key for them too, in a very real way. Information becomes key for them too, in a substantial way. And so there's a lot to be gained by essentially getting out as much information both to our communities as well as to those folks coming in, right? Regarding what has been here, regarding who has been here, and so on and so forth. And so I want to note, especially to younger organizers or people coming into this space, it's not just white folks versus everyone else. There are sort of large systemic issues. Going back to something Kate was saying, there are things written in to our laws and policies that are sort of the result of whiteness, but this does not mean that you sort of essentially take to task every new white person that you may see in a neighborhood. I want to also just note, neighborhoods do benefit from new people coming in. They sort of, a neighborhood does diversify in a real way. Certainly that was the case for East Hollywood over the 80s and over the 90s when Asian and Latin American migration came into the neighborhood, right? They enriched it with their own contributions. And so there are ways for, say, newcomers as well as long-timers to work together, if you will, to engage their communities in critical ways, given the time we're in, given the sort of political framework that we're all now in, if you will. So there are opportunities, if you will, even in gentrifying neighborhoods, for some serious community organizing. Certainly, that's what this panel space is about. I want to ask just a few more questions for us to, before we close out the night. I want to ask a little bit about something one of the attendees posed earlier in the chat, which was if we have a sense of, say, the cash for keys units that have been lost in gentrified neighborhoods, and how many cash for keys units have been lost to the market as a result, because it seems like cash for keys is a little more subversive. Certainly that's what Samanta was describing earlier with regards to her specific home when she first arrived to the neighborhood, if you will. But can we first define cash for keys and then ask or answer if we have any data about how many cash for keys units have been lost in LA over the last couple of years?
Samanta, do you wanna define cash for keys? I can talk about the data.
Yeah, so cash for keys is essentially if a building, when buildings are rent control, tenants have more protections, so you can't just like kick them out for no reason. You can't just evict them for no reason. And the only way a lot of times that landlords can increase the rent is by people leaving. And if a new owner, for example, buys a building and they want to renovate it or they just want to increase rents, the way that they do it is that they will pay, and there's a amount that they have to pay someone to leave based on how long that person's lived there and how many people live there. But they often will also just pay more. Essentially, it's like give them not a number, but like they will just give you more money to incentivize you to leave, right? Because you can actually choose to stay if they are doing like retrofitting, for example. but they really often don't want that because that means they can't raise the rent. So they'll give tenants a certain amount of money to leave. And once you do that, the thing is, a lot of times if you want to stay in the same neighborhood, that means now you have to find a new place to live, and the rent is higher because you just left your rent controlled unit. So whatever money you got is often gone very quickly paying this higher rent, unless you completely move to another part of the city, which is what's happening, right? Like a lot of people are going to places like Palmdale, Lancaster, and what happens is you end up losing that sense of community oftentimes, especially if you grew up in a certain neighborhood.
Yeah, and then also what happens is the rent on that rent controlled unit goes up to market rate. So only people can afford that can move into the unit that you vacated. So yeah, cash for keys is a strategy that a lot of cities allow and landlords take advantage of on a regular basis. And I think to speak to like how we get a sense of where this is happening or how broad it is, I think if to speak in terms of data, so all data that's collected on rent controlled housing is collected by HCID, the Housing and Community Investment Department of Los Angeles. And their task is to regulate rent controlled units. So if anything happens to a rent controlled tenant, you can like file a complaint. They will not respond to you. They're very incompetent. And the data they collect is really bad. We've gotten like really inconsistent data sets from them. We have to do a lot of labor to make the data sets they give us usable at all. But anyways, in different cities, there's different rules about what a landlord has to do to document or check in with anyone really before they do something. So whether it's an eviction or a buyout, a cash for keys offer, which we're talking about right now, really anything. In cities like San Francisco, there are really strict rules, like you have to file the buyout or the cash for keys with the equivalent of HCID. So you have to file that with the rent board of your city. And that's meant to like regulate landlords and what they can do to their tenants. In LA, there are no rules about filing that. So there's no data collected on when a buyout happens. There's no formal rules about filing anything, which is really dangerous. And it sets a precedent for landlords that says like, you can basically communicate with your tenants in any way. You know, there are requirements around an eviction notice. There are requirements around like letting your tenants know what's going on, but nothing has to be filed with HCID. So it's really hard to document and really hard to track these things. I think there's been a lot of pressure put on HCID and like city agencies like HCID to collect better data. We need much better public data on housing and tenants issues. For example, HCID just adopted a rent registry. So every landlord in LA has to tell HCID how much they're charging in rent, because otherwise it's just willy-nilly. It's like no one's regulating it if it's not rent controlled. So like all rental units that aren't rent controlled, nobody's tracking what's actually being charged. And so there are a lot of gaps, but I think like the tenant movement has done some work to name this and call for better data to be collected. But I do want to say on the aspect of data, I mean, I've been doing this work for many years now, and I just want to make a note that like the data won't save us, right? Like better data won't save us. I've been to so many meetings with city council members and different policymakers who are like, can you just tell me what's going on? Like, give me a map or give me a data set. And I provide it and we provide it, and then they continue to do nothing about it, you know? So I think listening to personal experience is enough, right? Like, we need better public data, but we should also just be listening when a tenant comes to HCID or comes to the city council and says, this is happening to me, believe it and do something about it. I'm really just that there's so much language about like, we need better data and like that will fix the problem. But it's really just a delaying mechanism, I think, in a lot of ways.
I think a related question there, and I've got just a few more before we call it a night for everyone. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, including that of our attendees. But a related question there is how much data we may or may not have on short-term rentals. These also get personal, right? Because we can be talking about a building that is predominantly rent stabilized, after which one tenant or another is removed, after which whoever may be coming in next decides to create a short-term rental situation there, right? The Airbnb. And actually, of course, as you very well know, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project originates from organizing around short-term rentals in that other city, right? So can you say a little bit about how these are impacting neighborhoods, communities, and what organizing is being done around the issue of short-term rentals?
Yeah, we've definitely as a collective done a lot of work on this. It's not my expertise actually, but I can say a little bit in general, and then I can share some projects on it where you can learn more about this. I mean, short-term rentals are another way to take rental housing away from the people who live in a community. And it's a way to consolidate wealth with people who own that property to make more money off of it. And cities have passed different legislations to say like, that you can only list a unit for a certain number of days a year, which has like really like, they've tried to cap basically the amount of short-term rental activity in different gentrifying neighborhoods. But yeah, there's different data sets that are going around. For a long time, it was like this one guy was scraping Airbnb's website and making that data available online. And like, that's the data that we had, because Airbnb is a private company. They don't have to, VRBO is a private company. They don't have to disclose their data. So we would like find it in other ways. I think now that for example, in LA, you have to register your short-term rentals. So that creates a data set. But I think a lot of people lie about it. It's not very well regulated. Recently in LA, the group No Olympics, who does organizing around preventing the Olympics from coming back to LA, really to prevent the displacement and gentrification that come with a big event like the Olympics, they and a few of our members launched a campaign called No Locks on My Block. And if you just Google that, I'll add it to the Q&A, but it's seeking to have people like crowdsource Airbnb, like if they see an Airbnb on their street, like enter it into this site. And so we can like make a crowdsourced data set trying to track like what's happening in different neighborhoods. But yeah, I think the short-term rental thing is, there's been tons of organizing it in places like we had a poster up in San Francisco that outlined like, you know, we don't want short-term rentals here, and this is what they do to our community. And then we had like there are a lot of people in different cities like New Orleans and New York and like Boston who made like mirroring posters. And so it was a cool like cities all over the country kind of trying to resist this. But I think it's an ongoing thing that needs to be regulated. And I think like projects like No Locks on My Block are trying to start that from the ground up. So that's as much as I can say about it, really.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that this does lead very well into what is essentially the final question, and a question that we do look to expand on going forward after this panel, certainly next Thursday just as well. But for a moment here, if we can too, the question of how communities can organize to, say, resist the buyout of their building, and how communities can organize to essentially stand up to these much larger developers, some of whom are hidden behind LLCs, as you were pointing to earlier, and others who are sort of maybe in the middle, but certainly on the verge of in some way collaborating with larger forces, larger gentrifying forces, larger displacing forces. Certainly Doña Elvia's story was a testament to that. A landlord who was friendly, who fell on hard times, who then needed to sell the building. The people he sold to then sort of were very intent on reaping the most profit they could from the space as soon as possible, hence displacement and so on. But what are some movements currently taking place around tenant organizing and community ownership and creating accountability around these issues that are challenging so many of our neighborhoods?
Yeah, I can speak for just a second, and then Chris and Kate and Samantha, if you want to add. I wish that Stefano was here for this to talk about the work of the Los Angeles Tenants Union, but there are so many things. I mean, I think we mentioned in the pamphlet some of the strongest tenant protections that we have in California, in cities in California. We don't have it statewide, but are the rent control and just cause protections that we got in the late 70s. And basically ever since then, loopholes like the Ellis Act, like cash for keys they've been like puncturing holes in those tenant protections. And those protections really try to just keep people in their homes. So in addition to the mapping project, I have been a tenant organizer since like 2014 in different groups in the Bay and in LA. And I can, I mean, the tenant movement is strong in California because we've been up against a lot. Like, we live in cities where there's a lot of threat of gentrification and displacement. And so in response to that, there's a really strong tenant movement, and there has been since the 70s. The reason we have those protections is because organizers fought for them at that time. Anyways, but yeah, I would say that, like, how can we take back community control? How can we fight some of these forces? One thing we've been working on this tool called the Victor Book, which helps, like, you can look up like who owns your building and who your landlord is and a lot of information about them. And I think the goal of that is to empower tenants to be able to like look up like, okay, this person owns my building, this other building of tenants is right over there, let me connect with them. And two buildings of tenants versus a landlord is so much stronger than like one tenant on its own. And so the work of the tenants union is banding together tenants to push against the pressure that they're feeling from their landlords, because a tenant alone who the landlord thinks doesn't know their rights is really seemingly easy to push out, and that happens over and over and over again. So I think, like, looking towards just organizing, just starting local tenants unions where you're talking about housing, where people can come shame-free and just say, you know, I'm like not able to make the rent, or like I have an eviction notice and I need help. Unfortunately, like, the tenant protections we have in law are the ones that we have, and there's a lot of holes to them. So that's why we need organizing. Like, the law will only help us so much. So, like, putting public pressure, having protests outside of landlords' houses and businesses to say, you know, don't do this, drop this eviction, you don't have to do this. I'm going to put enough pressure on you publicly to make sure that you don't carry this out. And the tenants union has been effective in doing that over and over and over again. So that's one thing. And then, sorry, I'm talking a lot, but I want to mention one thing, which is a campaign that's happening right now in El Sereno. A lot of you might have heard of it, but it's called Reclaiming Our Homes. This was a campaign that I got to work on in my role at LACLA, the Los Angeles Center for Community Law and Action in Boyle Heights. And basically, we realized that there was a kind of a whole neighborhood of publicly owned vacant homes. They're owned by Caltrans, which is a state agency, and they've been sitting vacant since the 70s. And we came together and said, you know, we're going to take control of these properties and we're going to move people into them. Like, that's as simple as it is. And And people probably, you may have heard of the campaign in Oakland around, they were called Moms for Housing. They still are called Moms for Housing. It's a similar campaign of moving people who don't have housing into vacant homes to use housing as to house people instead of a real estate investment, a commodity that you can profit off of. So like models like that, I think are the way forward in my mind. And there are a whole host of other things that people are doing, but I wanted to make sure and name those two campaigns today.
I actually wanted to ask a question. You know, as a journalist, I'm reporting on gentrification, on situations like what happened with Doña Elvia. A lot of the reporting I do is around these like legacy businesses in the neighborhood, and they don't really have any protections. What can be done about that, you know?
I also want to note for everyone, as we get into this, this event is being recorded. So if you do have to move on and you want to catch up with this later, please remember that this event is at the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council YouTube page, as well as on Facebook and Twitter for those of you all who frequent those platforms that much more. So please just remember that you can catch the entirety of this panel on YouTube, as well as Facebook and Twitter just later on. And just as a slight note to Samanta's question, I'd say certainly organizing, right? And public pressure and a sense of naming issues like those we have learned about with Doña Elvia's situation, right? Where there are such little, if any, protections for market units, if you will. That are spaces that are humble most of the time in these working class neighborhoods, but which serve tremendous purposes for business owners themselves, as well as for communities, right? This includes barbershops, this includes bakeries, this includes a Zumba studio sometimes for communities that are using them. So I do think creating more of a sense that these spaces are legacy businesses, but also legacy culture, cultural hallmarks, actually, that is really key for us to grasp as we organize further and as we apply public pressure on our council members and our city leadership in other ways, so that these spaces are protected as they need to be, right? And certainly when we talk community updates, like the big Hollywood Community Update Plan, the major question there for neighborhoods such as ours is, how are our small businesses being accounted for or not in your update or the city's update, right? Because if they're not, then certainly we're going to bear the brunt of a whole lot of influx yet again. And certainly we've seen enough so that we could organize spaces like these and analyze how we may respond in a real concerted way.
Yeah, sorry, real quick, to my experience, there was some messed up stuff happening in my neighborhood, and we reached out to the local tenants union. We reached out to the Los Angeles Center for Community Law and Action, and there's no laws against unionizing your neighborhood and creating unions, creating people power, and direct action. I think those are still essential. I think mutual aid is essential. For example, like folks that are providing fridges and distributing food, and like all of that is essential to like fighting what we're experiencing today. But yeah, I'm really down with direct action. I don't really trust policy, but that's just my 2 cents on this conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, to your question about commercial spaces or like non-residential properties, rent control for we used to have rent control for commercial spaces in like the 70s in Berkeley. It was the only city that had it, and it immediately got outlawed and it is actually outlawed in the state of California. So in order to get that, we would have to overturn that ban and then pass commercial rent control. I mean, it's like any other ask. Like, I think it's like join the tenants union and advocate for commercial spaces to be part of the campaign, part of the landscape, that what they're fighting for. Because yeah, it's like the story that we heard tonight is like so terrible because you feel like you can't do anything to stop it. But I think the work that you're doing, Samantha, to like bring light to it and to throw events like this and make sure people know that that's happening. Like, I think public pressure is one of the big things that we have on our side. So I mean, that's like contributing to the movement in that way. But yeah, it's a tough one. There aren't any like real policy protections for commercial spaces. I mean, another thing that like in a community plan, I went to planning school, but I don't have the answers here. I mean, I think there are creative things that planners could do to try to make space for legacy businesses. I'm totally not an expert on that, but like that's an ask that could be made a lot more. And I think there are people who are focused on that type of work.
So with all that, I do want to thank each panelist and essentially ask everyone how folks can support your work, how folks out there can be of service, can buy Samantha a cup of coffee and a little bit of a shout out or a little bit of support so that this work may continue, because it is such crucial work for each of us, right? So please go ahead and let us know, everyone, how folks can support you as you continue doing this excavation and this really critical work for our communities and for our tenacity through these challenges we're looking at.
Yeah, you can support by following This Side of Hoover. I'm really appreciative of all my followers and the people that contribute to the comments. You know, I think that's like the most valuable part. I think one of the most valuable parts of the account is constructing that together and having that dialogue. And I'm really, really thankful for everyone that does that. I think if you want to support the work, I do it for free, and I need to find a way to make it sustainable. I might start a Patreon soon. I'm still figuring that out. So if I started, support that. If you want to buy me a cup of coffee, my Venmo is in my Twitter bio, Samanta_Helou. But yeah, just give me a follow and keep contributing to the comments. That's really special and really important.
Yeah, and for the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, just follow us, keep in touch. We have like all social media accounts, and like we're a collective. So if you're interested in joining, like anybody is welcome. Our intent is to like, no matter what skills, like everybody is welcome. So yeah, we have a collective in LA that you're more than welcome to come to. And yeah, just keep in touch. Thanks again for having us as part of this series.
Yes, thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you to all our attendees, especially those who have hung on all the way through. I do want to shout out one more time that next Thursday, there are actually 2 events that I want to get on folks' radar that are really relevant to these discussions, especially for East Hollywood. On Thursday morning at 8:30 a.m., there's the Hollywood Community Update Plan public hearing. So at that meeting, the LA City Planning Commission is scheduled to hear from those of us who live in these neighborhoods, those of us who live in Hollywood, those of us who do work here. And so there's a strong coalition known as the Just Hollywood Coalition that's organizing a lot of hotel workers, organizing a lot of folks for more affordable unit requirements for new developers coming in, folks that are organizing legacy businesses, including in Thai Town, including in Little Armenia, including in Hollywood, so that these spaces will be protected in any upcoming updates. So that is next Thursday, follow jimbotimes.com as well as This Side of Hoover in particular to get the flyer for that if you want to pass along a flyer to anyone else in the neighborhood who may be interested in attending that with us. And then, of course, next Thursday is the third and final installment of Making Our Neighborhood, Redlining, Gentrification, and Housing in East Hollywood. We will discuss the fight for housing and issues around housing and how essentially this is where we head next in terms of organizing for our communities, organizing for our neighborhoods. So please be sure to check that out next Thursday at 6 p.m. We have a number of great guests lined up who we'll be announcing over the next couple of days. But unless I've missed anything, Samantha or anyone else, please do let me know. Kate, I see you unmuting, so please go right ahead.
I was just going to say maybe to plug the hope.xyz component of the project in case people didn't catch that last week.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. The hope.xyz component for this series is very crucial. We do know that folks in the comments have questions for us, that folks have feedback for us. Please write down hope.xyz or type it into the search bar as soon as you can and get us your questions, get us your comments, tell us what we can still analyze further in this discussion and discussions of this type going forward. It's really crucial for us too, as we showcase this work and as we let other people know why it's relevant, right? So you all attending and you all listening in need to participate if possible. We want your participation, and hope.xyz is a very special, very simple, very accessible way to do this. So please go and check that out. See our project there, which is listed on the front page as Making Our Neighborhood. And we will be absolutely grateful to have your input in these discussions, that's for sure. Anything else, any final announcements?
Yeah, I just want to say sorry, Chris, you wanted to say something.
Sorry, I kind of would feel a little uncomfortable leaving this panel without mentioning that like people of color can be gentrifiers in neighborhoods. And one of the main discussions that I've had in the past is that to think about the phrase, your entertainment is our displacement. Think about the places where you're going to bars, the shops you're going to. I think that's super essential. I forgot to mention it earlier about the conversation about race. And another thing is just be critical about your community, be critical about the places you purchase, and feed people. Housing is important, and respect your houseless community and neighbors as well. I just wanted to end on that note, but yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for that note. And also shout out to Chris for the amazing pamphlets that he designed. Please visit jimbotimes.com to learn more about the pamphlets. And if you are an educator, we are going to figure out a way to sell bundles of the pamphlets. They are in 5 languages: Tagalog, Armenian, Spanish, English, and Thai. And they are really, really great learning resources to just learn the basics of gentrification and redlining. So please visit jimbotimes.com to learn more about those. And please RSVP to our final installment at easthollywood.eventbrite.com. So we'll see you next Thursday at 6 p.m. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye,
y'all.
everyone. Good night.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.